Great group this morning. We weren't quite sure how the poll. Of course, you're all Minnesotans. You've been through this before. So great. I'm excited to welcome our speaker today. Kristofer Phan Coffman is an assistant professor of New Testament at Luther Seminary. He graduated from St. Olaf. And he where? That's okay. And he had degrees in religion and Nordic studies. Listen for that a little bit later. He was MDiv. He has an MDiv degree from Luther Seminary and completed his PhD in classical and Near Eastern religions and culture at the University of Minnesota. He's the first person of Cambodian descent to receive a PhD in biblical studies. He's also the author of a chapter book, Christmas Cookies in Cambodia, the Bible and Race in America, and Dialogues on Race, and has written several book reviews as well as academic articles on topics ranging from Norwegian, American, Lutheran history. You might have to come back and explain that. To biblical interpretation and translation. In addition to his academic work, he has a keen interest in food and farming, and Coffman has written popular articles on responsible consumption and agriculture. Translates recipes for the award-winning new Nordic chef Mikkel Karstedt. Maybe some of you've seen him. And served as copy editor and translation consultant on the forthcoming cookbook Saoy, The Forgotten Flavors of Royal Cambodian Home Cuisine by Chef Rotanak Ros. And the topper, he worked at Fortress Press. 3 times, so we were colleagues. What a unique resume, and we're excited to hear you. We're going to turn off the lights so you can see the screen a little bit better. But all the lights on, you're gonna get a full view.
Thank you very much, Scott. I am glad that you are all here, and I'm glad to be here. I am not a native Minnesotan. I grew up outside of Los Angeles, so I've been here 15 years now. But I am still impressed how many people get up and out when it is negative 11 degrees outside. I'm very thankful for that. We are going to talk today about the Gospel of Mark, and I'm very excited when I was asked about this topic because the Gospel of Mark is my favorite gospel. I teach a course on the 4 Gospels at Luther Seminary, and every time I ask students what their favorite gospel is, and Mark is always underappreciated. That's one of the reasons I've titled this presentation The Hidden Gospel. We're going to talk that hiddenness shows up in a variety of different ways. We're going to do an overview. And one of the things that I want to be very clear about before we begin is if you asked 10 different Mark scholars to give you an overview of Mark, you would get a dozen different answers. There are many different ways of understanding how the gospel fits together, how it is when we look at the arc of the gospel, where we divide it, where we think the major breaks are. So I'm going to give my take on the Gospel of Mark, and I hope that it helps you as you think about reading through the gospel to give you some, I like to think of it as kind of kothos, places to hang your hat when you're thinking about it, but also knowing that as you encounter and experience the Gospel of Mark, you may see different ways of organizing it. I'll talk a little bit about how exactly I've come up with my organizational system. So first of all, again, Mark, the hidden gospel. So this is in a museum in France now. It's a lovely ivory altarpiece. There's Jesus in the middle. And traditionally, these are the 4 beasts they occur twice in the Bible. One in Ezekiel's vision of the wheels. He sees 4 beasts with wings. And again, in the book of Revelation, John, the Revelator, sees these 4 beasts. One like a human being, one like an eagle, one like a lion, and one like an ox. And traditionally, this has been taken as representing the four evangelists. So you'll sometimes see in churches, for instance, my wife grew up at Fieldberg Lutheran Church in Huxley, Iowa. And if you go in Fieldberg, they've got a cross in the front, and in the four corners are these four kind of images of the gospel writers. And Mark, interestingly enough, has always been associated with, in the lower left-hand corner, I think it looks more like a cheetah, but this is meant to be the lion. Here's the funny thing though. For a long, long time, so from about maybe the year 200 to the early 1800s, Mark was considered to be a summary of Matthew. You'll notice if you look at Matthew, Matthew is considerably longer than Mark. There are many things in Matthew, perhaps most notably the Sermon on the Mount, which are not in Mark. And so and in our Bibles, it goes Matthew, then Mark. So it was assumed that Mark was some sort of maybe missionary summary, that somebody had shortened it so that it was easier to present or easier to remember. And with that, Mark was mostly ignored. So for instance, if you were a scholar of the Reformation or interested in Martin Luther, and you wanted to know what Martin Luther thought about Mark, you'd be mostly out of luck. You can go to Luther's works and you can see that he's got sermons on Matthew, he's got some sermons on Luke, he's got lots of sermons on the Gospel of John. He has very little on Mark. And this is the same John Calvin, pretty much name a famous Christian theologian from before about 1800, and they really don't pay much attention to Mark. But then something very interesting happened. And this is a long story, but in the 1800s, they started to look at this question again. They looked at Matthew, Mark, and Luke. As you read them, you'll notice they're quite similar to one another. And so they started to look at these three gospels and to think about this problem again, and came to, interestingly enough, the opposite conclusion, that Mark, in fact, was the first of the gospels, and that the other two expand upon what Mark is saying. And so from that point onwards, and especially in the 20th century, Mark, therefore, has become much more important. And so there's a lot more written on Mark. We spend a lot more time thinking about Mark now than we did for the first 1500 years or so of Christian thinking on the Gospels. So I do want you to be aware of that when we think about Mark and when you study Mark, it's really a modern phenomenon. We don't have this long history like we would if we were studying the Gospel of Matthew together. Any questions about that before we move on to thinking more about the Gospel itself? All right. So, as I said, there are different ways to organize how you think about the Gospel of Mark. And when I think about the Gospel of Mark, I'm always asking two questions, and they help me to organize. These questions are, where are we? That is, geographically, what place is Mark locating us in? And then who's around? Who are the people who Mark has placed in this scene? And these two things help us to start thinking about how we organize and think about the organization of the Gospel of Mark. I put up here, it's always good, I think, to acknowledge where you get these questions. This is the famous Danish scholar Geert Helbeck, who unfortunately none of his work has been translated, which is too bad because he's got some very interesting things to say about place in Mark. Where are we in the Gospel? So we're going to talk a lot about that. But before we get there, we have to keep one other thing in mind. This is my former colleague, Craig Kester, who taught at Luther Seminary for many, many years. And he taught a course that I've taken over called Genesis to Revelation. So you start at the beginning, and now we do it in 10 weeks, which is really a sprint. But you go from Genesis to Revelation. And one of the things that Dr. Kester talks about over and over again, and I think it's important in Mark as well, is that when we think about ancient narratives, they move in spirals, not straight lines. So when we think about the biblical narrative, it does not go in a straight line from Genesis to Revelation, but instead we see repetitions and we see patterns as we go along. This is the same with the Gospel of Mark, that instead of thinking of Mark 1 and running through to Mark 16, we want to look at the patterns and the repetitions that Mark is pointing out to us. Because as we do that, we see how Mark builds on themes, or how Mark changes patterns subtly to help illustrate the points that he's making about Jesus and the gospel. Any questions before we move on? Right. In that case, we need to think about the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's a funny place to start, but how many folks have read the Iliad and the Odyssey? We have a few folks. Okay, yeah. So the Iliad and the Odyssey are important for a number of reasons. One is that they are pretty much the first works that we consider Western literature and written in Greek. But they start an interesting pattern, and it's up at the top of the slide here. It's this pattern called in media res. You didn't know that you were going to have to learn some Latin today. But media means in the middle, and res means of things. What's interesting, for instance, about the Iliad is it's a story about the Trojan War. You open it and you read the first book, and it starts 10 years into the war. A lot has happened before it starts. You open the Odyssey, and what you notice is that Odysseus has already been wandering for something like 13 years on the first page. So again, it starts you right in the middle. And Mark, you open Mark, and what do you notice? Jesus is already an adult beginning his ministry. It begins in a very different place than the other Gospels. Both Matthew and Luke begin with infancy narratives, especially Luke. We've just gotten through the Christmas season, and so that famous Luke 2. And Luke actually begins before with Zechariah and Elizabeth and the birth of John the Baptist. The Gospel of John, does anybody remember where the Gospel of John begins? In the beginning, at the beginning of time. In the beginning was the Word. But where does the Gospel of Mark begin? With John the Baptist in the wilderness. So again, this follows a pattern we see quite often in ancient literature. To begin in the middle of things, to drop you straight down in the action. And again, out in the wilderness. So remember, we're thinking about places. And one of the things we see is that the beginning of the Gospel of Mark is very interested in the wilderness. Now, I am a Greek professor at heart. One of the things that I'm very interested in, as you might have heard from my biography, is translation and how we translate things. And I always think that this is a funny translation, because when you read wilderness, Americans generally think of things like Yellowstone National Park. You go out into the wilderness. The wilderness is where you go, where it's unspoiled nature and so forth.
In Minnesota, we think of glaciers.
Yes, exactly, of the boundary waters, right? We're going to go away from civilization up into, again, that kind of unspoiled nature. That's sort of what we have here, but more the wilderness is that place of wandering. So there are, again, these patterns, right? You go way back in the biblical narrative. Who goes to the wilderness? Jesus. But if you go even further back, the Israelites, they wander in the wilderness for 40 years in Mount Sinai. Prophets go to the wilderness. The prophet Elijah, when he flees from King Ahab, runs to the wilderness where he is fed by God and so forth. And so already this is, as I said, we're moving in spirals here. Already from the very beginning. And Mark is nice because he often tells you what he wants you to notice. He begins with these quotations from the prophets. In the wilderness, make way for the Lord. And so again, notice that spiraling is going to continue to happen. So from the wilderness, we're going to talk a lot about maps. As I said, this is geography is very interesting in the Gospel of Mark. And the first thing that we see is that the Gospel of Mark takes place primarily in two locations, Galilee, which is a region, and Jerusalem, which is a city. And I'm gonna wander away from the microphone to point, and then I'll walk it back.
You have a pointer on your clicker,
Oh.
the center button.
Nope, not that one. About- There we go. I promise I know how technology works. Galilee is up here. And we're gonna talk about a lot of different regions within Galilee. Jerusalem is all the way down there. And the thing to notice, it's hard to see on this map. I've got another map where it's a little bit more evident. There are these roads, these are all Roman roads. So you can't just go straight from Galilee to Jerusalem. You gotta choose one of these paths. And Mark is going to tell us a lot by where Jesus moves around within these particular regions. This is the Jordan River. It flows down into the Dead Sea. And so from the Sea of Galilee. And so one of the things we see is Jesus starts somewhere, we're not quite sure. He's in the wilderness with John the Baptist, but then he returns to Galilee. And so the first part of the Gospel of Mark, when we think of big divisions, Mark chapter 1 through 9 takes place primarily in Galilee, with a few side trips. We're going to talk about those side trips. The side trips are really important because Mark wants to show you something when Jesus departs from Galilee. Mark 10 is our travel book. That's how we get from Galilee down to Jerusalem. And then the entire rest of the gospel, Mark 11 through Mark 16, takes place in Jerusalem. Questions about that or thoughts on that before we continue? All right, let's dig into this traveling or into these places. I'm just going to go kind of chunk by chunk. So we start with Mark 1 through 5. And as we said, Mark 1, the kind of preamble begins in the wilderness with John the Baptist. But then the very interesting thing, I remember I was so fascinated the first time this clicked on for me. In Mark chapter 1, Jesus has a house. He takes his disciples, after he calls the first two disciples, Simon and Andrew, they go with him to his home. And his home is in Capernaum, the city here on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. Capernaum is a very interesting place archaeologically. It's the site of the manufacture of basalt millstones. So when you're grinding grain in the ancient world, you have a giant millstone, which is just it looks like a big donut, and it's driven usually by a donkey that's attached. And these millstones are made in Capernaum and shipped all over the ancient Mediterranean world. And it's very interesting because Jesus, of course, is traditionally described as a carpenter. But this word, again, that translation, we'll talk about this, may very well mean somebody who works stones. And so the fact that he has a house in Capernaum is really interesting. And maybe there is a link there. But what we see here in Mark 1 is this emphasis on Jesus and his home, Simon Peter's home, which he goes to as well, and healings. There is in Mark chapter 1 quite a bit of healing going on. Mark 2 and 3, this continues. We're still in Galilee. We're still around Capernaum. But now we get from the very beginning. Again, it's not just that Mark starts right with the beginning of Jesus' ministry, but he also starts right with the controversies. And so in Mark chapter 2, if you look at this, it's nothing but debates. Debates over whether Jesus can forgive sins. This is the very first debate. They lower the paralytic man through the roof, and Jesus forgives his sins. And this already, so I mean, this is the first episode in Mark, and already we have controversy. There's the debate over why Jesus's disciples don't fast. There's the debate over why Jesus's disciples pick grain while they're walking through the fields on the Sabbath. And these debates all happen right in Mark 2 and 3. So from the very beginning, we have these controversies taking place in Galilee. And we also have, let's say, debates and death. At the end of Mark chapter 2, the Pharisees and the Herodians are already plotting together as to how they are going to do away with Jesus. So, I mean, we've gotten less than 2 chapters into the Gospel of Mark, and Mark already wants you to know that Jesus' life is in danger. Again, this is part of that spiraling that we talk about. These things are highlighted and then they go away for a little bit, and then they're highlighted again, and then they go away for it, and so forth. And then demons. Mark, more than any of the other gospels, is very interested in the demonic and the way in which the demons, remember we talked about gave this the title, the hidden gospel. One of the fascinating things, I encourage you to continue to look at this as you read Mark, is who knows Jesus's true identity? And the demons do. This is a fascinating thing about Mark. And Jesus tells them not to tell anybody. It's very puzzling. And it's part of how Mark drives the action forward, is that Jesus is continually encountering these people, or not these people, these beings that know who he is, at the same time as the crowds around him are confused by his identity. Because that's what we get in Mark chapter 4, the parables. And one of the things about the parables in Mark is that they're confusing. The disciples asked Jesus, what in the world is going on with these parables? Why do you continue to speak in this way? And Jesus, he gives a very interesting quotation from Isaiah about the purpose of parables. And the purpose of parables, according to Mark, is to obscure and to confuse. And so Mark, this is a theme in Mark. The confusion that Jesus creates, the hiddenness of his teaching. So again, and I point these out in Mark 1 through 5 because they will come up again later. And then finally in Mark 5, we have a series of miracles all about unusual uncleanliness. We have perhaps most, I don't know if I want to say most famously, but very prominently placed in the beginning of Mark 5, the so-called Gerasene demoniac. So here we have the demons again, but this man who lives in the tombs and who cannot be controlled and who has a legion of demons and lives next to pigs and who knows who Jesus is and who scares the bejesus out of the people in the town nearby. But what's so scary about him? Does anybody remember how the story ends? That he's okay. That's the scariest part, is they come, the people from the city come and see that this man is perfectly in his right mind, wearing all of his clothes and sitting at Jesus's feet. And they say, Jesus, please leave. And again, I want to point out, this is that same thing that Mark's doing in 1 through 5, is asking that question, what is going on with Jesus? What is so strange about him? And it has to do with all of these things. Questions or thoughts on that before we continue to Mark 6 through 9?
The spiraling thing you talk about, I've noticed in current literature, a lot of authors are starting in the middle of the story.
Yeah, so it's very interesting. Yeah, it's very interesting how when you look at kind of the history of literature, this device comes in and out of fashion, where sometimes authors really will make use of it to start in the middle and then give you flashbacks or give you, give you other sorts of ways of looking, where other times you'll start at the very beginning. Harry Potter is a great example where you start when he's 11, you go till he's 17, like straight through. So young adult literature, but yeah, it continues. Yes, please.
Richard Wilbur has a poem about this scene with Gerasene demoniac, and people come from town and ask Jesus to leave. And he turns this into an economic decision. They want him to leave because he's harmful. I mean, he sent all the pigs into the sea. And it's he kind of relates it to a contemporary time. Sorry, I didn't.
No problem. And so that's Richard Wilbur. Yeah, okay, so evidently there's a poem by Richard Wilbur about this. And this is the thing. So I'm glad you brought this up because it goes to the fact that In Mark especially, much more than in Matthew, and especially much more than in Luke, Jesus is a disruptive figure. He's a figure whose arrival is not always welcome. And we're going to see that when we jump ahead to Mark 11, when Jesus shows up in the temple. Again, spirals. That's that same sort of thing where that disruption will take place. And it is an economic disruption. So I think that's a good, is that Wilbur like the pig?
No.
All right, continuing on. So Mark 6 through 9, here we're going to see that spiral. In the sense that almost everything that we got from Mark 1 through 5 is going to be repeated again in Mark 6 through 9 in slightly different form, but all again within the context of Galilee. So Jesus goes back to Nazareth and is rejected by his family. We get more disciples. In this case, the disciples are sent out. It's the sending of the 12. So in the beginning, we get the calling of his disciples. And in Mark 6, we get the sending of his disciples. John the Baptist shows up again, this time tragically. He gets his head cut off by King Herod in Mark chapter 6. But again, we return to that theme of John the Baptist. We get in the boat again, just as we got in the boat and we went across to the land of the Gerasenes and we come back. Again, the thing about geography, one of the things that often happens is notable things happen when they are traveling across the Sea of Galilee. This happens again here. We get Jesus walking on the water. In Mark 1 through 5, there was the calming of the storm. So again, these episodes related to the Sea of Galilee and boat travel. We get discussions of clean and unclean again. Before it was the Gerasene demoniac, it was the woman who had the flow of blood. These were both issues of cleanliness, especially Gerasene demoniac. This is one of those things that for modern folks, it's not as evident, but in the ancient world, it would have been. He lives in the tombs. There's very few places as unclean as places associated with the dead. But then we get back to this clean and unclean. Jesus has a debate over washing hands before eating. And so that debate, again, it circles back. Although that time it's a little bit more controversial, because in the other times, it's simply he is healing or restoring a person who is outside of society because of their uncleanliness. In this episode, he now is calling into question the washing of hands in general. So that's a really good example of how Mark introduces a theme, cleanliness and uncleanliness, and then comes back and kind of turns the volume up on it, is how I like to say it. Yes, please.
Is that the purpose of the spiral, of repeating these things to keep us focused on what the message is or what's important or helping us to remember? Is that what he's doing?
Yeah, so there's a couple, the question was, what's the purpose of the spiral? There's a couple of things that we can say about it. One is that it helps to, as you said, remain focused. So it gives you remember, originally this was something spoken. So this is something you'd be listening to just as much as you'd be reading. So it gives you places, as I said, to hang your hats. You see, we got that theme. Oh, John the Baptist is back. And now you remember what was said about John the Baptist earlier. We're talking about cleanliness again. You remember what was said earlier. So there's that repetition. It also allows, as I said, the nuanced playing with, I'm going to use that terminology, playing with these topics, presenting them in one way and then presenting them in another, which helps you, engages you to think about the differences between the two portrayals of these topics. The John the Baptist is a great example of this, because in the first place, we see John the Baptist as the wilderness prophet, baptizing Jesus, calling people to repentance. In the second place, we see John the Baptist, the victim of King Herod. And the way in which these two play with each other will then set up different things, especially about Jesus going forward. So there's a lot of utility in this kind of spiral of a narrative. Both for what the author is trying to do, but for us as readers and listeners to help us follow along with the narrative.
Also reminds me of the spiral in our lives too, how we're up and down, which is, think you conquered something and then comes back in a new way.
No, very much so. And so one of the things we talk about with these kinds of patterns is they're very natural patterns. And when we think about these things that are recited or these things that are come up over and over again, it reflects our experience in ways that the sort of straight line way of looking at things sometimes does not. Yeah, anything else before we move on? All right, we're going to summarize very quickly Mark 1 through 9. So just to talk about some important places. Again, most of these are in Galilee, but Jesus's hometown is Nazareth, and we see things associated with Nazareth. We visited multiple times. But his house is in Capernaum. This is where much of the action takes place. The Sea of Galilee, I've got sea in quotations, we're Minnesotans, and so the comparison that I often use is that the Sea of Galilee is about the same size as Mille Lacs. So if you've driven up to Mille Lacs, it's a big lake, but it's not that big of a lake. And it is now called Lake Gennesaret because it is, again, it is more of a lake than it is a sea. But Mark is trying to tell us something by calling it a sea. The Decapolis, which is on the other side, kind of over here of the Sea of Galilee, which again, Jesus journeys to, and the Gerasene demoniac is associated with this. Let's see. Way up at the top here, Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea, like Caesar salad. This has to do with the emperor. And so again, when Mark tells us that Jesus travels somewhere, he intends for us to think about what that place might mean. So the fact that, for instance, the transfiguration takes place in this place associated with the emperor, Caesarea Philippi, is a very interesting detail. And then his farthest journey takes him to the regions of Tyre and Sidon, so up here where he encounters the so-called Syrophoenician woman. And again, Mark is trying to tell us something with this journey. But just a quick rundown of places. So I encourage you to note other places as you read through Mark 1 through 9 that are mentioned. Questions or thoughts before we move on?
That's still basically all Galilee too.
Yeah, so everything that I mentioned is Galilee except for Tyre and Sidon are part of a different Roman province, and then the Decapolis is its own province. But everything else is within Galilee, including Caesarea Philippi. Yeah, so then here is our transition, which is Mark 10. And so we get on the road, and on the road, our theme is discipleship. We see this thematization, is that how you pronounce it? We see discipleship thematized, that there is this question of what does it mean to follow Jesus as they're literally following Jesus. So this again, as Mark gives you that place to hang your hat. He says we are traveling and discipleship is about following. And what does it mean to follow on the road? As I said, there are multiple ways to get from Galilee to Jerusalem, and we are told that he goes through Transjordan, which is a fancy way of saying he goes on the other side of the Jordan River through Jericho and then down into Jerusalem. Jericho, of course, being a very important place in the biblical narrative, and yeah, just another one of those places where Mark is saying, think about the places they're going. Mark 10 is an important chapter, but Mark 11 through 16 are even more important, so we're going to hop right on to that.
I wonder if it's also, isn't about where he doesn't go in this case?
Yeah, so this is an interesting thing. He avoids that place right there. We don't get any mention of Samaria in the Gospel of Mark. As we know, the Gospel of Luke will make a big deal out of this. The Gospel of John as well will. So that's another good thing to think about, is not just where does Jesus go, but where does he not go? In this case, the problem with not going is also we have very little to go on. So we call these arguments from silence. You can say things more confidently when, for example, the Gospel of Mark tells us that Jesus goes to Caesarea Philippi and the transfiguration happens there. We know things about Caesarea Philippi. It's an imperial city. It has a statue of Zeus or a temple to Zeus there. So these things are being placed in conversation with one another. The difficulty with an argument from silence is it's much harder to know. Why does Jesus not go through Samaria? Does he not like Samaritans? Is it an inconvenient road? Was he advised not to go there? Had he just never, we can come up with all these different reasons for it, but arguments from silence are always harder to deal with. So just keep that in mind as you're thinking about places he goes versus places he don't. They're often more intriguing. We often wonder much more about them. But again, the difficulties that we do deal with, that question of why would he avoid this place? There we go. And then in Mark 11, he comes to Jerusalem. And again, as you look at the different gospels, it's really interesting to see how this is played out. The Gospel of John records several visits to Jerusalem in accordance with the Jewish festivals. The Gospel of Mark, it's a big deal when he arrives, because what happens? This is an Italian fresco, the triumphal entry. So when he arrives in Jerusalem, it's a big deal. And Mark wants you to see that. And then we get to go back to that thing about economics and disruption, the so-called cleansing of the temple. So we get a lot of big action right in Mark 11 with the introduction to Jerusalem. I've got Bethany in there in parentheses because Bethany is a city outside Jerusalem. And one of the interesting things is that Jesus does this thing where he comes into Jerusalem and then withdraws to Bethany. And there's a little bit of this back and forth action there as the narrative progresses until we get to the end in which the location is Jerusalem and Jerusalem all the way through. So again, these are just subtle things to look at. There's a very interesting and sort of foreboding episode where Jesus comes into the temple, to Jerusalem, and Mark tells us that he looks at the temple, and then the day is late and he withdraws, and that's the only action. And again, that kind of Mark is wanting us to notice where Jesus is moving and what he's doing as he moves. At the temple, spirals again. Now a new set of people are asking Jesus questions, and a new set of people are questioning Jesus's authority. So we got the same pattern in the synagogue. We talked about this way back in Mark chapter 2. But now a second group, or a different group of people, is coming forth to ask these questions. The people associated with the temple, the Sadducees and the chief priests, they're called. And so they ask many of the same questions. Where does Jesus get the authority to do these things that he does? Just as this was asked in Galilee. But now the stakes are higher, because it's not just some rural synagogue, to use that kind of terminology. You know, it's one thing if you say this in Huxley, Iowa. It's another thing if you say these things in Rome. Again, this back and forth between how the location and the repetition changes how we read the stakes of the matter. And the stakes are going up and up. In Mark 13, we're still in Jerusalem. We're still in the temple again. This is where the back and forth stops. Now we are centered in this place. And we get the so-called little apocalypse. And Mark 13 is one of the most vivid of the chapters of Mark, where Jesus is describing, because one of his disciples says, look how beautiful the temple is. It's made of such large stones. And that sets Jesus off on this discourse about the destruction of the temple, the so-called last days. It's a painting by William Blake. William Blake, if you want apocalyptic paintings, is a very good source for those. Questions or thoughts before we move on? Mark 13 is the end of the precursor to the Passion narrative. So in Mark 14, we begin what we call the Passion narrative. Yes, please.
Going back just a little, Jerusalem and Bethany, going back and forth. I can't remember, did Mark make any reference to Martha and Mary and Lazarus?
So Mark does not. So one of the things we see in the Gospel of Luke and then in the Gospel of John is the place where Jesus stays is named as the house of Martha and Mary and their brother Lazarus. Mary of Bethany is what she's sometimes called to distinguish her from all the other Marys who are in the Gospels. But we do not see that in the Gospel of Mark. Yeah.
What if any, what would you say about the destruction of the temple and this part of Mark? Is there any connection there that people make anything of that?
Yeah, so this is a great question in that in Mark 13, we get a lot of talk about the destruction of the temple. And what we do know is that in the year 70, the temple is destroyed. There's a couple things to take away from that. Number one is that the destruction of the temple is an ongoing theme throughout the Bible. We talk about spirals and we talk about kind of repetitions. The difficulty with the temple is that Solomon builds it and then it is torn down by the Babylonians. And then it's rebuilt by Ezra, and then it's torn down again by the Romans. And this is a theme throughout the biblical text, is the impermanence of the temple. It's often thought that the destruction of the temple gives us some clues as to when Mark was written, in the sense that the imagery that he uses is reminiscent of the destruction of the temple itself. This is a difficult argument in that it makes good logical sense, but the problem with it is that if the temple were to be destroyed at that point, there's a very definite way to do it. In other words, it's not that surprising of a prediction to make. And so this is the difficulty, is that the Romans, very unfortunately, had a very distinct way of destroying cities. And so Mark is playing with that imagery. It could be because he's experienced it himself. It could be because this is the way that the Romans generally did these sorts of things. But it's probably that Mark, having experienced these sort of things, is reflecting on the destruction of the temple in that way. So it was traumatic, but not surprising, is the way that I often put it. Questions or thoughts on that before we go on? It's a big thing that occurs right outside of our biblical narrative. But it's always, I think it's good to think about, because it's always in the background. When you think about the New Testament, it's always in the background that the temple is no longer there. So even though we're talking about it a lot in the Gospel of Mark, it's no longer there. And the only remnants of it are the so-called Western Wall, or the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. Oops. 1, 2, 4. Can do it. There we go. So when we get to 14 through 16, again, this is what we call the Passion narrative. And it is the narrative of Jesus' trial and then crucifixion. And again, we're mostly in Jerusalem, but we have some very important places that are marked for us. One is that we go from Jerusalem to Gethsemane, the so-called Mount of Olives, which is across the valley, the Kidron Valley from Jerusalem. And then we are taken to a few places within Jerusalem. I love this painting of the trial of Jesus, because one of the things that Mark is very clear about is that the trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin, so before the chief priests and the elders, takes place at night. Because they take Jesus to Pilate first thing in the morning. And so the questioning that we see takes place at night. We very often, if you watch it in movies or so forth, it's like in bright daylight and he's out in the middle of a little forum or something like that. But again, that's something Mark wants you to notice. That's not just the where, but the when something takes place. And then he goes to the so-called Praetorium. This is where Pilate lives during the Passover. It's the Roman, I don't know what you want to call it, city hall maybe is a way to describe it. It's an administrative place. And from there we go to Golgotha, where he is crucified, and from there to the tomb. So again, Mark walks us through these different places where key events of the Passion take place. Any questions or thoughts about that before we get to the last slide? And so to cap off this talk of spirals and this talk of the way this narrative works, of course, Mark is interesting because, like Matthew, Mark ends in the same place it begins. And what it is in Mark 16, 7 and 8, we're going to talk a little bit about that at the end. There'll be a little postscript here. But in Mark 7, the angel at the tomb says to the women, "Why are you looking for Jesus here? He is going ahead of you to Galilee." And somewhat snarkily, I think, just as he told you. I love that line in terms of you should have remembered. But the point simply being that the narrative moves in this big circle, that we start in Galilee, and after all of the events, it directs you to look back towards Galilee. So again, but now you see Galilee in a different light. Now you see the whole narrative in a different light because of where we ended up. And then, of course, we get to the very famous ending of Mark in 16:8. The last words of Mark, they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And this is that it goes back to that hidden gospel, that confusion that Jesus causes goes right up until the very end. But even at the end of this gospel, after all of these things have happened and they've seen all of this, their response is terror and amazement. And Mark leaves you with that cliffhanger. And I think it's a very clear aspect of this pattern that he wants you to see. These questions about Jesus and now he asks you the biggest question about Jesus. What does it mean that he is not dead anymore? And that's where I think it's a powerful way to end. And this goes back again. We started in the middle of things, just like the Iliad and the Odyssey. And the funny thing about the Iliad and the Odyssey, it's very frustrating when I used to teach it to undergraduates. It ends before you want it to. The Iliad, which is the story of the Trojan War, students get to the end and they say, "Where is the Trojan horse?" It's the only thing they know about the Trojan War. And it's not there. It ends with the funeral of Hector, who is the main defender of Troy. The Odyssey even tells us that it's ending before Odysseus is given another task to do, but it's not even narrated. And in the same way, just as we began in the middle of things, Mark leaves us in the middle of things. He doesn't tell us where it goes. He leaves us, as I said, with this this question that just draws you forward to ask, where does it go? Questions or thoughts on that? Like I said, we had a little postscript, but this is where I think the Gospel of Mark kind of comes together. Yes, please.
Around 1980, my husband and I were living in Brooklyn, New York, and we went into Manhattan to listen to a Sunday afternoon presentation off Broadway. A man standing there having memorized the entire Gospel of Mark. And there was only one break where he just had it there in case, but he had memorized it, and it was the most powerful experience that we had gone through. Now, if I'd have known all this cool background stuff, that's more meaningful, that would have been, but it was truly powerful to hear it from beginning to end.
Yeah, so this is really a great detail, and it's a great detail. I'm glad you noted that he had the nuclear just in case. One of the things we know about quote unquote reading in the ancient world is that most of the people who were readers, so say in church, did not know how to read as we think about it. That instead they memorized what it is that they were supposed to read, and they had the words there as a prop, as a way to help them remember what they were supposed to say. But it's not like we do where we look at the words and then can speak them. And so it's possible that this is part of why the person had the Bible there. But we know that the Gospel of Mark, like the letters of Paul and the other Gospels, was probably intended to be spoken like this, that somebody would remember it, and maybe they would have a copy there to help them get through their recitation. But that is the way that most people would have experienced it, was in somebody saying it to them. And this is a very interesting thing. It's not that long to read it out loud, even though, when you look at the Gospel of Mark, it's a pretty short book. And so to think about sitting there, and we know for a fact, if you go to services from non-Western folk, that is, if you go to African immigrant services or Hispanic immigrant services, Eastern Orthodox services, they're much longer than the services we are used to. They are not an hour from start to finish and you're ready for the Vikings game. And so it's not unusual to think that the entire gospel may have been recited within this time frame. And what it does, I'm so glad you pointed that out, is when you hear it all at once, you can hang your hat on all those things. You see, it's not as though you have to remember I read last week, or I remember I heard 3 months ago about this thing. You get it all at once, and so you can see how it is. Yeah. Questions or thoughts as we wrap it up here? Yes, please.
I know there are a couple of alternate endings to the Mark. I
Yeah.
prefer this one. It's
Oh, I also
more,
like.
more realistic, actually. But I suppose the early church, they wanted to make sure people got the fact that Jesus was raised from the dead and that they weren't told about it, but.
Yeah, hold that thought. So I've got one more slide on the alternate
Okay.
endings, but back here before we continue.
Just as you were thinking and what Pastor Peter said, what's not there, is there anything that you would bring in on who Mark is, on why he chose the specific things to document for us then?
Yeah, so again, this is the interesting thing is that the Gospel of Mark, of course, there is somebody behind this gospel, somebody wrote it for us, but they are, as any author, or as most authors are, in the background. They are there, of course, but they are not there. One of the things that I think we can say with good certainty about the Gospel of Mark, or the writer of the Gospel of Mark, excuse me, is that they are heavily influenced by the Apostle Paul. That much of the vocabulary and the way that they seem to think about Jesus corresponds to what we see in the letters of Paul. Even from the very beginning. So this is another, and I'll have to come back and give you this lecture another time. Paul is the first person to call this thing, this life and death of Jesus, the gospel in the singular. And so it's not a mistake that Mark 1:1 begins the beginning of the gospel singular of Jesus Christ. He's trying to tell us a very particular thing. And the other gospels don't begin there. The other gospels don't use that word gospel for themselves. But Mark does. And the way that he presents Jesus, I think, really is meant as a biographical explanation of the letters of Paul. The letters of Paul, of course, are letters, and they're very theological. And the Gospel of Mark says many of the same things, but through the life of Jesus instead of through the letter form. And so I think that we can say fairly certainly that they are a follower of Paul and are trying to show us how the things that Paul is preaching show up in the life of Jesus. To bring it back to the ending, one of the things that people have been very confused about Mark for a long time, and part of the reason why it was not popular, especially in the Middle Ages, was Mark has, to put it charitably, a negative portrayal of the disciples. To put it uncharitably, they're dumb as rocks. There's a pun there with Peter. But we see over and over again that the disciples in Mark do not understand. And they fail and they fight with each other. And where does it end? These women who are his disciples, they can't even say this news. They're terrified. And we see in that, I think, reflections of the difficulties that the Apostle Paul had with Jesus' disciples. Especially if you read Galatians chapter 2 is a great place to look at this. The controversy between Paul and Peter over the gospel that Paul is preaching. And the negative portrayal of Peter in the Gospel of Mark, I think, is very consonant with that. So I think it's a great thing to think about. Is this author is he's put this together in a particular way, and thinking a little bit about it does help us to see that. All right. Anything else? I'm going to give you 2 seconds then on the endings of Mark. So the other endings of Mark. If you open up your NRSV, one of the things you will see is that there is the so-called short ending of Mark, which is where it ends at 16:8, and then there is a shorter ending and a longer end, or a long ending and a longer ending. There are a number of different endings. The reason for that is that when the King James Bible was translated, way back in 1611, the only manuscripts of the Greek New Testament they had, the New Testament was originally written in Greek, were those collated by a man named Erasmus. Erasmus had put together these Greek manuscripts, mostly medieval Greek manuscripts, and Luther used them to translate his German New Testament. The translators, the King James, used them, and they include what we term Mark 16:9 through 20, which is everybody's favorite verses about snake handling. Those are in there, and they include, again, as you were pointing out, they include resurrection appearances. They include some of these prophecies that Jesus gives to his disciples. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, they discovered 2 very good manuscripts of the New Testament from the 3rd century, so from the late 200s. One was in the Vatican Library, one was in a monastery at Mount Sinai. And interestingly enough, in these manuscripts, Mark ends at 16:8. So we have these medieval manuscripts that have these additions, and we have these very early manuscripts that do not have these endings. And so that is why we think originally the Gospel of Mark ended at 16:8. But people have been reading 9 through 20 for so long that that's why they are in there in brackets. But this is very common. But that is the very short summary of why we have these funny endings out. But as I've argued, and again, as you read Mark, you can evaluate this argument for yourself. I think that 16:8 fits with the pattern that Mark is trying to show us throughout his gospel, and that the other ones kind of subvert that pattern. But any questions about that before that's again, like a 30-second summary of a complicated thing. And just any questions in general before we go. I'll stick around for a moment as well if folks have any questions, but yes, please.
Have you written a book about the Gospel of Mark? Or if you have not, would you?
So I wrote my dissertation on the Gospel of Mark. So I do not intend to turn that into a book, but we'll see what happens. But yeah, the Gospel of Mark continues to be a research interest of mine. All right. Well, thank you all very much. It was a joy to be here.